Hi guys, today we are going to talk about and plant our asparagus crowns, and these are a little bit later than I was hoping to do these. My surgery has delayed me and I've not been able to plant them out even though they arrived a while ago. I'm hoping that these are going to be okay. So this is what an asparagus crown looks like. So we've got the crown part here and you can see that's one of the asparagus tips that's starting to form there, and then we have the roots that are these dangly alien looking things. Normally when your asparagus arrives you want to get them planted out as quickly as you can and have the bed as prepared as you can. Sadly these arrived while I was in my surgery and I've been unable to deal with them until now. So they have dried out a little bit, which isn't ideal, and I'm going to pop them in a bucket of water just to give them a little bit of a drink. If you buy the ones from the garden centres that are in like a pack of 2, then you'll likely need to do this as well. So before I do that, I'm actually going to remove any broken, snapped or unhealthy looking roots, and then I'm going to pop them into some water to start soaking. These are a variety called Burgundyne, which have lovely purple spears that are quite sweet and can be eaten raw as well. I've bought mine from the organic gardening catalogue. Asparagus is a perennial vegetable, giving us around a 25-year lifespan. Each of these crowns will give you roughly 25 spears. However, what we need to remember is that these crowns need to establish, so we won't actually be harvesting any of these in the first year. In the second year we can harvest a couple, and then in the third year we're going to harvest some more. And each period of time that we harvest these, we always need to make sure that we stop harvesting them by the summer solstice. This allows the remaining spears to grow to their full height, and we allow these spears to grow from mid-June to allow the plant to reserve its energy for the next year's growth and keep those plants really good and strong. We're looking for a sunny, well drained and fertile soil that does have some protection from wind, because those ferns get very tall and we're going to want to support those and make sure they don't snap. If you have a clay soil or your soil isn't well draining, then you can add some sharp sand or some grit to that area. The other thing you can do is also plant these into raised beds to help those roots to stop them going rotten. Ideally we want a pH of between 6.5 and 7.5, so if you've got very acidic soil then it is worth adding some lime to the area. Traditionally they are planted between November and April, so we are a little bit beyond the time right now, and if you have got that very clay soil or soil that's very weedy, then it might well be worth you holding off and getting some in later in the year instead. Because the roots of asparagus lie very shallow within the ground, we also want to be careful that we don't have a really weedy area. If you've got a lot of perennial roots, then to work on those before we get these plants in is going to be really helpful, and then also to continue to keep pulling them up every week within our asparagus patch, just to make sure that those annual as well as perennial weeds don't take hold and become something that we need to put a spade in for. We can weed these beds and then feed them with a bucket of manure or compost, and you want about 1 bucket per square metre that you're working on. Traditionally asparagus is planted on trenches where we then add a mound, and the top of the crown goes on the top of the mound and then the roots drape down the side. This is more difficult if you've got perennial weeds and things like that, and it's going to be something that you definitely want to do if you don't have very well draining soil. And for this we're going to have spacings of around, we want to dig the trench 8 inches deep, 12 inches wide and 18 inches apart, making sure that the crown is around 2 to 3 inches from the top of the soil. If you are planting more than one row, then we're looking at around 2.5 feet between each row. I'm planting mine today in a no-dig fashion where I'm not actually going to be using those trenches and mounding up a hill for the crown to go on top. I can do this because I don't have an issue with draining. My beds, it's also a raised bed, so I don't need to be concerned about these roots rotting. But if you do, then I will share just one of them of how I would go about doing that, just to give you an indication pollination as well. Most of the crowns that we buy are male, however the occasional female spear can be sent up which will produce berries. To avoid these setting seed, which can cause us an issue with too many asparagus plants in one area and become like weeds, what we're going to do is, before those berries drop, we're going to make sure that we harvest that spear and remove it. The spacings that I'm using today is planting them around 3 inches deep, 60 centimetres roughly apart, and then any additional rows that I would be adding would be around 1 metre apart. If you have any plants that are already established, then this is a great time, if you haven't already done so, to make sure that we add a layer of mulch, and they do really appreciate a seaweed mulch as well. It isn't ideal to grow asparagus in pots, and they do much better and will last the long time that this perennial can do if we can grow them in the ground. But if you are going to put them in pots temporarily, or you just have no other option, then you want at least a 60-litre bucket, and then you should find that you get around a 3 to 4 years worth of harvest. But we are going to then have to make sure that we are watering them well and keep them well fed. For these crowns to establish well, it's going to be really important to make sure that we keep these well watered going into the warmer weather and that they don't dry out. We should start seeing activities and spears forming from these quite quickly. This is the bed that I'm going to be planting mine into today. So there is actually already a few asparagus crowns in here that the slugs and things are already deciding to munch on. So they are young crowns, so I haven't actually started to harvest these. First thing we're going to do is start to remove the mulch, and then we'll start prepping it. I am just very gently scraping the top surface of this bed to avoid any damage to the asparagus in the centre. Now I'm removing the celery roots that have been grown in here over the winter and the self-sown salsify in the middle. The first asparagus crown I'm popping in the more traditional method, just to show you the difference. So I'm making sure to dig quite a deep hole and then adding some well rotted manure to the hole and giving that a little bit of a dig in just to mix it up. And then next I'm going to add the compost back into the centre to make a mound of a little hill, and then we're going to pop the asparagus roots either side and the crown into the centre. The crown head is still around 2 inches from the top of the soil, and then I'm going to just backfill that. As I have fed this already at the base, I'm not adding any more manure onto the top, but I will do later on in the year just to make sure it's got enough food. The remaining crowns I am just clearing a space around 3 inches deep, and then making sure to have enough side to side space to have those roots spread out really well. And then I'm just replacing the soil back over the top and adding a layer of manure onto the top rather than into the hole. And I will add an additional layer later on in the year as well. You could also add a good layer of compost here, it doesn't need to be manure. And finally I'm going to give them a good water in and make sure to keep this bed moist over the next few weeks.